Today we're at the Hawke Conservancy Trust in Hampshire and we're going to be photographing these beautiful birds of prey. The easiest way to get up close to birds of prey is at a sanctuary or a zoo like this. Not only are you likely to see scheduled aerial displays throughout the day, many also host tailored photography days and private sessions where you can work with the falconers to get the perfect shot. Working with our knowledgeable bird handler Cedric here, I was able to work out the best angle and anticipate the bird movement, which really helps when shooting subjects that travel very quickly. With bird photography, the right gear can make all the difference. I had a Nikon 80-400mm lens, which is plenty long enough to fill the frame with a distant bird. I also brought a 50mm for capturing animals on the ground. And along with the lenses, it's also worth bringing a tripod to help prevent shake and spread the weight of the heavy telephoto. Of course, having the best gear for the job is important, but the best wildlife photographers don't just succeed because they have the right kit or because they can get to the prime locations. A knowledge of the subject is just as essential. If you know when and where animals are likely to appear, you can anticipate their movements and get yourself into the perfect position. Birds of prey are happiest when flying into the wind, as this gives them the uplift they need to keep their large bodies in the air. So if you want to shoot a bird head on, the best place is upwind. Takeoff and landing is another great time to try a shot, as a moment before bigger birds land, they tend to spread their wings and softly swoop down. The drop in speed makes it easier to get a sharp shot, and the wings beat at the wind in a vertical position, which often makes for a more interesting shape. Tracking the movement of the bird while in flight can be a real challenge, particularly with a long lens. A good panning technique can help. Rather than twisting the shoulders or arms to move the camera, try locking your elbows down and then turn at the waist or shuffle your feet so that your whole body pivots as one. If you've never photographed birds of prey but are thinking about visiting one of these centres, I'd recommend practicing your technique beforehand in your garden with pigeons, blackbirds or anything else that flies nearby. This will give you a better idea of what to expect and how to approach the shoot. Photographing birds in flight is by far the trickiest part of bird photography. Focusing is the most critical factor, particularly if the bird is travelling towards the camera at speed. You'll definitely want to use AFC, which stands for continuous autofocus, as this means that unlike AFS, which stands for single autofocus, the autofocus will engage continually as long as the focus button is held. So it helps you lock onto your subject. And when it comes to choosing a focus point, the best option is to use a single point and move it around the frame so it sits over your subject. Most Nikons have several autofocus modes. 9-point dynamic area AF works by giving you a cluster of 9 focus points based around the single point you choose. All these points stay active and aware, so if the subject slips beyond the single point, the other points will lock onto it. In practice, this means you have a slightly larger area to work with than the single square selected in your viewfinder. 21-point dynamic AF works in a similar way, but with a larger cluster of active points. Many bird photographers swear by 3D tracking autofocus. 3D tracking works by detecting the colour of your subject, so it's effective if the bird is against a contrasting backdrop like a blue sky, but not so much if the bird blends in with a background of trees. As well as choosing a focus mode, it's also worth considering how you trigger the autofocus. If you're half pressing your shutter button for focusing, I'd highly recommend you stop. Almost all Nikon DSLRs can be set up for back button AF focusing. This makes life so much easier for action shots, as you can trigger the autofocus with your thumb and then use your forefinger to press the shutter button at the perfect moment. It takes a little getting used to, but keeping autofocus and shutter separate gives you much more freedom and control. And one other setting that may help shave a few vital split seconds off the time it takes to focus is a force limiter switch. Many telephoto lenses have a switch like this on the barrel that will lock off part of the focus range. And this helps to prevent hunting in that part of the range. So if you know your subject isn't going to be very close, set the lens to limit. When shooting action, you'll improve your chances of capturing the perfect moment by using a high drive rate. This means the camera will fire continuously while the shutter button is held down, giving you a sequence of frames to choose from. As for exposure settings, my preference is to use manual mode and auto ISO. This way I can choose whichever combination of aperture and shutter speed I like, while my ISO will vary depending on how the camera meters the scene. So I can control depth of field by choosing a wide aperture for a blurred background. I can also ensure my shutter speed stays fast enough to capture the action. Typically, I'd use a fast shutter speed of at least 1/1000th of a second to freeze bird motion, and if panning at speed, you might want to up this to 1/2000th of a second. If you've got confidence in your panning technique, you could try dropping the shutter speed to create panning blur. Start off with a speed of around 1/200th of a second, and then press the shutter as the bird flies parallel to the camera. It can be tricky, but get it right and the bird will stay sharp while the background turns into streaks of motion blur. Think about the direction of the sunlight falling on the bird too. Light from behind works very well during takeoff as it filters through the bird's wings for a beautiful backlit effect. At sanctuaries like this, there's also the added advantage that the birds can be photographed on the ground. This little white-faced owl called Humbug was happy to pose, allowing for a tight composition and precise focusing. Approach these kind of shots in the same way you would a typical human portrait. Used wide open, a 50mm prime lens gives a wonderful shallow focus effect. Focus on the eyes and they'll come out pin sharp while everything else slips into beautiful blur. When the bird is flying at speed towards the camera, even the best autofocus may struggle to keep up. If you know roughly where the bird is headed, you could try pre-focusing on that spot. This works very well if you know the bird is going to be landing on a perch, or even better, if someone throws a fish into a pond for an African fish eagle like Victoria here. By pre-focusing on the spot where the fish dropped and then shooting continuously as the eagle entered the frame, I could increase my chances of getting at least one sharp shot in the sequence. So there we have it. These majestic animals can be a real challenge to capture with your camera, but the results are well worth it.